After my parents appointed my brother as my new superior, he demoted me in an effort to sabotage my career and then claimed it was for my own benefit. Hi everyone, I'm 28 years old and work in the family business. Well, I did until recently. It's a medium-sized company that I devoted the last 6 years of my life to. After earning a degree in business, I started as a junior manager and worked my way up, eventually becoming the chief operating officer. I didn't get this position handed to me. I worked hard, proved my abilities, and had the results to show for it. The company was thriving, and I felt like I was contributing something important. But about 6 months ago, my parents, Catherine and Richard, decided to shake things up. That's when they brought in my younger brother, Mason, who's 25. Mason, the golden child. Mason, who had no business experience. Mason, who could hardly manage his own schedule, let alone the entire company. I knew this would end badly the moment they told me, but I didn't realize just how awful it would get. Let me give you some background so you can understand the family dynamics. Growing up, Mason was undoubtedly the favorite. As the youngest of us three siblings, our parents always spoiled him. If Mason got into trouble at school, they would make excuses for him. If he wanted something, he got it. Meanwhile, Haley, our older sister, who's 30, and I were expected to be the responsible ones. Haley mostly stayed out of the drama, but I always resented the double standards. So when my parents announced that Mason would be joining the company, I simply asked what role he'd be filling. They looked at me as if I had just insulted their life choices. Catherine told me that Mason would be starting as the new CEO. I couldn't believe it. I had been COO for 2 years, overseeing the operations and keeping everything in order. I assumed the natural progression would be for me to take over when my dad stepped down, but apparently my parents thought Mason's fresh perspective was what the company needed. When I pointed out that Mason had no qualifications, Catherine responded, "Logan, you've always been so serious. Mason has charisma. He'll bring energy to the team." Charisma and energy, those were the reasons my years of hard work were being ignored. Great, right? Mason walked into the office like he owned the place, which technically he did now. He didn't even bother learning the basics before making changes. Policies I'd spent months refining were thrown out. Teams I had carefully built were reassigned. He didn't even ask for my input. Instead, one afternoon, he called me into his new office and told me, "Logan, I think we need to switch things up. I'm demoting you to regional manager." Regional manager? I couldn't believe what I was hearing. I tried to stay calm and asked why. His response? "I think you need to get more hands-on experience. It'll be good for you." Good for me? I'd been hands-on since day one. If anyone needed to learn from the ground up, it was him. But no, Mason thought he could just waltz in, push me aside, and take charge. I appealed to my parents, hoping they would see reason, but they didn't. Catherine said, "Mason's trying his best, Logan. Support him. He's your brother." Richard, ever the mediator, added, "This could be an opportunity for you to grow in new ways." Are you kidding me? At first I thought maybe I could make this work. Maybe Mason just needed time to adjust. But it quickly became clear that he wasn't interested in running the business. He was only interested in running me. Every decision he made seemed designed to humiliate me. He started showing up late to meetings I'd scheduled, criticizing my ideas in front of the team, and giving me tasks that were beneath my skill level. One day he even had the nerve to ask me to get him coffee. I thought he was joking, but he wasn't. The worst part? The team started noticing. People who had once respected me now looked at me with pity. Some even whispered that Mason was only there because of nepotism. No surprise there. But it didn't make me feel any better. I was losing control of the company I had worked so hard to build, and it felt like there was nothing I could do about it. Every time I tried to stand up for myself, Mason would flash that smug little smile of his and say, "Logan, I'm the CEO. This is my call." The final straw came last week when Mason decided to cancel a deal I had spent months negotiating with a major client. This deal was a game changer for us, and I had worked out every detail myself. Mason didn't even bother to understand the deal before shutting it down. He just said, "I don't think it aligns with the direction I want to take the company." What direction? He didn't have one. That's when I realized something wasn't right. This wasn't just about Mason being bad at his job or my parents playing favorites. There was something bigger going on here. Why were my parents so insistent on backing Mason, even at the expense of the company's success. Why did they seem so determined to push me aside? I don't have all the answers yet, but I'm going to figure it out because this isn't just about my career anymore. It's about my sanity. After Mason demoted me and started making reckless decisions one after the other, I knew I couldn't just sit back and let it happen. The company was quickly falling apart under his leadership. A few senior staff members, people I'd worked with for years, started expressing their concerns to me privately. Jenna, our head of marketing and one of the sharpest people I know, pulled me aside after a particularly disastrous meeting and said, "Logan, he has no idea what he's doing. He's going to destroy everything you've built." She wasn't wrong. Mason's charisma and energy weren't enough. He kept trying to implement ideas he'd seen on TikTok or read about in random business books without understanding how our company actually worked. At one point, he suggested we spend half of our annual budget on a flashy new ad campaign without even consulting the marketing team or reviewing the data. When I tried to warn him how risky it was, he laughed and said, "Logan, this is why you're stuck in a box. You're too afraid to take risks." The campaign was a massive failure. And guess who got blamed? Mr. Mason told the board that I hadn't fully supported his vision, which made it difficult for the campaign to succeed. I wanted to scream, but I just clenched my jaw and said, "Understood." I needed to stay calm if I was going to figure out how to handle this. Around this time, I started noticing something strange. Mason seemed almost intentional in his incompetence. It wasn't just that he was bad at his job. It felt like he was actively trying to make me look bad. He would forget to invite me to important meetings and act surprised when I didn't show up. He promised clients things we couldn't deliver, then blamed me when we couldn't follow through. Every time I tried to push back or offer a solution, he would brush me off with a condescending comment like, "Logan, you're too emotional. This is why you're not COO." Mason once threw a tantrum because the office coffee machine was out of oat milk. Meanwhile, my parents were no help. Catherine kept insisting that Mason was learning and that I needed to give him time. Richard stayed quiet most of the time, but I could tell he wasn't happy with how things were going. Still, he wasn't about to stand up to Catherine or Mason. At this point, I was running on pure frustration. I couldn't understand why my parents were so set on making Mason the face of the company. Sure, he was their favorite, but this went beyond favoritism. It felt like there was something bigger happening that I wasn't aware of. That's when I decided to dig deeper. I started going through old company records, searching for anything that could explain my parents' sudden obsession with Mason's career. I wasn't sure what I was looking for, just anything that could help make sense of this mess. It didn't take long before I found something suspicious. Buried in a pile of financial reports were a series of unusual transactions from about a year ago. Large sums of money had been funneled into a consulting firm I had never heard of. The firm's name, Praise Solutions, sounded generic, but when I looked it up, I couldn't find any real information about it. No website, no LinkedIn profiles, nothing. I brought this up to Lucas, my best friend and former college roommate, who happens to be a financial analyst. He agreed to help me investigate it. A few days later, he called me and said, "Logan, I don't think Praise Solutions is a real consulting firm. I think it's a shell company." A shell company? As in a fake business used to hide money or move it around without anyone noticing? But why would my parents get involved with something like that? And what does it have to do with Mason? I didn't have time to dwell on it, as Mason was already scheming his next big mistake. He decided to merge two departments without consulting their heads or even giving them a heads up. The result was complete chaos, with employees unsure of their roles and projects slipping through the cracks. When I tried to step in and fix the mess, Mason accused me of undermining his authority. It felt like every decision he made was deliberately designed to create problems, and I was always the one left to clean up the aftermath. The breaking point came during a quarterly board meeting. Mason was supposed to present the company's performance, but he didn't bother preparing anything. Instead, he rambled about vision and synergy, completely ignoring the actual numbers. When one of the board members asked about our declining profit margins, Mason froze and said, "Logan can explain that." Excuse me? I hadn't even been included in the prep for this meeting, and I didn't have the data in front of me. Mason knew that. Still, I did my best to answer the board's questions while Mason sat there smirking. After the meeting, he pulled me aside and said, "See, this is why I need you to stay in your lane. I'm the big picture guy. You handle the details." I wanted to punch him in the face, but instead, I just walked away. At this point, I realized something important. Mason wasn't the real enemy here. My parents were. They were the ones who put him in this position and enabled his behavior. If I wanted to fix this, I needed to address the root of the problem. That night, I sat down with Lucas and Jenna to strategize. We reviewed everything I had uncovered so far, the shell company, the financial discrepancies, Mason's disastrous decisions, and started piecing together a plan. If my parents thought they could push me out of the company I helped build, they were about to get a rude awakening. This wasn't just about saving my career anymore. It was about saving the company and my sanity. After talking with Lucas and Jenna, I became obsessed with figuring out what my parents were up to. Mason was clearly their puppet, but for what purpose? Why push me aside after everything I'd done for the company? Why were they willing to risk the company's success for someone as unqualified as Mason? Lucas and I kept digging into the shell company, Praise Solutions, and it paid off. It turned out Praise wasn't just moving money around. It was a holding account for a series of real estate investments. That's when things got interesting. Some of the properties tied to Praise were in my parents' name, others in Mason's, and the amounts being shuffled through these accounts were huge, far more than the company could afford to lose without serious consequences. I couldn't wrap my head around it at first. Were they embezzling from the company? If so, why? My parents were already wealthy. They didn't need to steal. And why involve Mason in something so reckless when he could barely manage a grocery list? I decided it was time for answers. The next weekend, I went to my parents' house for what I pretended was a casual family dinner. Mason wasn't there, which was a relief since I didn't want him interfering. After dinner, when it was just me, Catherine, and Richard sitting around the table, I brought it up. Trying to keep my tone neutral, I said, I came across something interesting in the financial reports recently. Catherine raised an eyebrow. Oh, what's that? Praise Solutions, I said, letting the name hang in the air. Catherine stiffened slightly and Richard froze mid-reach for his glass of wine. Bingo, I continued. I couldn't find much about it online, but it seems the company's been funneling money into some real estate investments. Quite a bit of money, actually. Some of it even seems to be in Mason's name. Care to explain? There was a long, tense silence, then Catherine said, Logan, I don't think you understand the full picture. I asked, What's that? That's why I'm asking, I replied, trying to keep my voice calm, despite my racing heart. Catherine sighed and exchanged a glance with Richard, who looked like he wanted to be anywhere else. Finally, she spoke. Your father and I have been planning for the future of the company. We've been diversifying our assets to ensure we're not relying on a single income stream. Praise is part of that strategy. Right, I said, leaning forward. And how does Mason fit into this grand strategy? Catherine's face hardened. Mason is the future of this family, Logan. He has the potential to take the company to new heights, but he needs guidance and support, and that's what we're giving him. I couldn't believe what I was hearing. You're risking the entire company on someone who doesn't even know basic accounting? I asked. Mason doesn't care about the business. He's using it as his personal playground. That's not true, Catherine snapped. Mason is learning. He just needs time. Time. That's all they ever said. Mason needs time. Mason needs support. I had been running this company for years, but apparently I didn't deserve any of that. I turned to my dad. You're okay with this? Letting her run the company into the ground just to coddle Mason? Richard flinched but didn't answer. Catherine answered for him. We're protecting our family legacy, Logan, something you clearly don't understand. That's when it hit me. This wasn't just about Mason. It was about control. Catherine wasn't just protecting Mason. She was protecting herself. Praise Solutions wasn't a legitimate business strategy. It was a way to consolidate power and make sure I couldn't challenge her authority. Mason was a pawn in her game, and I was the threat she needed to neutralize. You're not protecting the legacy, I said slowly. You're protecting your legacy. You're afraid I'll take over and make changes you don't agree with? Watch your tone, Catherine said sharply. You have no idea what you're talking about. Don't I? I shot back. I've been running the day-to-day operations for years. The company has thrived because of me, not Mason. And now you're undermining everything I've built to keep me out of the picture. Catherine didn't say anything, but the look on her face told me I'd hit a nerve. Richard, to his credit, finally spoke up. Logan, it's not what you think. We're trying to secure a future for all of you. Don't, I interrupted. Don't insult me by pretending this is for my benefit. I stood up, my hands shaking. If you think I'm going to stand by while you and Mason destroy everything I've worked for, you're dead wrong. I'm not some kid you can manipulate. This ends now. Catherine's face went pale, but she didn't stop me as I walked out of the house. I didn't know exactly what my next move would be, but I knew one thing. I couldn't let them keep control of the company. Not if I wanted to save it. After that conversation, I went into overdrive. I began gathering evidence. Financial records, emails, anything that could prove what was going on. Lucas and Jenna were instrumental in helping me put together a plan. We decided the best way to take back control was to expose Mason's incompetence and my parents' shady dealings to the board. But before we could act, Mason did something that pushed everything into overdrive. He approved a deal with a questionable supplier that violated multiple regulations. Not only did it put the company at risk of legal trouble, but it also jeopardized our reputation with long-standing clients. When I found out, I realized I couldn't wait any longer. It was time to fight back. After Mason approved that reckless supplier deal, I knew I had to act immediately. The deal wasn't just bad, it was catastrophic. The supplier had a history of cutting corners, and partnering with them violated several industry regulations. If the deal went through, the company could face massive fines, lawsuits, and permanent damage to our reputation. I tried to stop it before it was finalized, but Mason wouldn't listen. When I confronted him about it, he smirked and said, "Relax, Logan. You're just overthinking again. This is the kind of bold move that'll put us on the map." I wanted to scream. Bold. It was suicide. But Mason wouldn't back down, and my parents were still standing by him. Catherine brushed off my concerns with her usual patronizing tone. "Logan, you're so risk-averse. That's why you'll never be a visionary like Mason." That was it. I'd had enough. If they were going to ignore me, I'd make sure the board couldn't. For weeks, I'd been collecting everything I could. Emails, financial reports, meeting transcripts, anything that would expose what was really going on. Jenna was a huge help here. She'd been quietly documenting all of Mason's missteps, from missed deadlines to inappropriate behavior. Together, we compiled a damning case against him. Meanwhile, Lucas was digging deeper into Praise Solutions. He found more shady transactions, including payments to consultants who didn't exist, and unexplained withdrawals that lined up suspiciously with Mason's actions. Mason's lavish spending spree had begun to connect the dots. It became clear that he wasn't just incompetent, he was also benefiting from my parents' scheme in ways that far exceeded mere favoritism. The final piece fell into place when Lucas uncovered that one of the properties linked to Praise Solutions was a beachfront condo in Mason's name. My parents were funneling company funds to support his lifestyle. I called an emergency board meeting, knowing this would be my one chance to convince them, so I had to come prepared. Jenna and Lucas helped me assemble a presentation that laid out everything: the financial discrepancies, the supplier deal, Mason's incompetence, and my parents' role in enabling all of it. The day of the meeting, I walked into the boardroom feeling like I was gearing up for a battle. Mason was already lounging in his chair, looking entirely unfazed. Catherine and Richard sat beside him, acting as confident as ever, clearly thinking this was just another family discussion where they could dismiss my concerns. But this wasn't a family discussion. This was business. I began by explaining the disastrous supplier deal, highlighting why it was a ticking time bomb. Then I moved on to Mason's track record, listing each poor decision he'd made since taking over as CEO. As I spoke, I noticed the board members exchanging uncomfortable glances. They had been skeptical of Mason from the start, but now they were starting to grasp how serious things were. Then I dropped the bombshell, the Praise Solutions scheme. I showed them the financial records, details of the shell company, and the beachfront condo in Mason's name. By the time I finished, the room was silent. Mason was the first to speak up. "This is ridiculous," he said, his voice shaking. "Logan's just bitter because he's not in charge anymore." "Bitter?" I shot back. "Bitter doesn't even begin to cover it. I've spent years building this company only for you to waltz in and treat it like your personal playground. This isn't about me being bitter. It's about you being unfit to lead." Catherine interjected, her voice cold. Logan, you're overstepping. This is a family business. We make decisions as a family. I turned to the board and asked, does this look like a family business to you? Because to me, it looks like a slush fund for Mason's lifestyle. If you want this company to survive, you need to act now. The room erupted into chaos. Mason tried to defend himself. Catherine kept claiming I was blowing things out of proportion, and Richard sat there looking like he wanted to disappear. But the board wasn't swayed. By the end of the meeting, they had voted unanimously to suspend Mason as CEO pending further investigation. With Mason out of the picture, I was reinstated as COO and given temporary authority to manage the company while the board sorted things out. My first priority was to undo the damage Mason had caused. I canceled the supplier deal, restructured the departments he'd merged, and worked overtime to reassure both clients and employees that we were back on track. It wasn't easy. The company's reputation had taken a hit, and morale was at an all-time low. But with Jenna's help, we started to stabilize things. Slowly but surely, we began to recover. Meanwhile, my parents were furious. Catherine called me almost every day, demanding to know why I was turning against my own family. Richard sent a few half-hearted messages asking me to reconsider. Mason, of course, was nowhere to be found, probably sulking in his beachfront condo, but I didn't care. For the first time in months, I felt like I could finally breathe. Just when I thought things were settling down, Lucas came to me with a final revelation. While digging through Preya's financial records, he found evidence that the shell company wasn't just funding Mason's lifestyle, it was also covering up losses from a failed investment my parents had made years ago. They had been quietly draining the company to pay off their debts, and Mason's appointment as CEO was their way of keeping me from finding out. I felt sick. My own parents had been using the company I'd worked so hard to build as their personal piggy bank, and they had thrown me under the bus to protect their secret. That was when I realized I couldn't trust them anymore. Not with the company, not with anything. At the next board meeting, I presented Lucas's findings and made my case for permanently removing Mason and my parents from any decision-making roles in the company. It wasn't easy. Catherine fought tooth and nail to maintain her influence, but in the end, the board sided with me. Mason's role was officially terminated, and my parents' voting power on the board was significantly reduced. I was appointed interim CEO with the understanding that I would need to prove myself over the next year. That was fine by me. I wasn't interested in power plays. I just wanted to fix the mess they had made. Since then, I've been working tirelessly to rebuild the company. It hasn't been easy, but we're finally starting to see real progress. As for my family, things are tense to say the least. Catherine and Richard still think I betrayed them, and Mason refuses to speak to me. Haley has been supportive, but even she's hesitant to take sides. Honestly, I'm okay with that. I've learned the hard way that family and business don't always mix. For now, I'm focused on doing what's best for the company and for myself. After I was officially named interim CEO, the work of rebuilding began in earnest. Mason's time as CEO had left us with more issues than I originally realized. Damaged client relationships, plummeting employee morale, and a financial mess my parents had created that was worse than I'd expected. It felt like I was trying to put out a dozen fires at once. Jenna was a lifesaver during this time. She took on a larger role, helping me rebuild trust with the team. Together, we tackled the most pressing problems, stabilizing operations, renegotiating contracts with frustrated clients, and reassuring employees that we were heading in the right direction. One of the toughest challenges was dealing with the fallout from the Praise Solutions scandal. While the board had agreed to keep the details private to avoid a public scandal, the internal investigation made it clear just how deep the problems ran. My parents had been siphoning money from the company for years, using it to cover their bad investments and bankroll Mason's lifestyle. It was infuriating to realize how much damage they had done, but at least now I had the authority to stop it. Speaking of my parents, things between us remain complicated. Catherine is still furious with me. She's convinced that I betrayed the family by going to the board and taking Mason down. She's tried reaching out a few times, but it's always the same conversation. Her trying to justify her actions and me refusing to let her off the hook. I don't know if we'll ever fully reconcile, and honestly, I'm okay with that. I can't keep letting her manipulate me. Richard, on the other hand, has been quieter. I think he feels guilty, though he hasn't said it outright. He's reached out a few times to check in, but I can't tell if he knows how to repair the damage. Part of me wants to forgive him, but another part can't forget how he stood by and let all of this happen. Then there's Mason. I haven't spoken to him since the board voted to remove him. He sent me one text after the meeting. "You'll regret this." That was it. No apology, no acknowledgement of the chaos he caused. Just a threat. I doubt he'll ever take responsibility for his actions. And I've made my peace with the fact that we probably won't have a relationship moving forward. It sucks, but I'd rather have distance than more drama. Haley has been a surprising source of support throughout this whole ordeal. She stayed out of the initial conflict, but once everything came to light, she reached out to let me know she had my back. "You did what had to be done," she told me one morning over coffee. "Mason and Mom might never see it, but you saved the company and the family in a way that means more than I can say." About 2 months after I was named interim CEO, the board approached me with an offer. They wanted me to take the role permanently. At first, I wasn't sure if I wanted it. After everything that had happened, the idea of tying myself even more closely to the company, and by extension, my family, felt overwhelming. But the more I thought about it, the more I realized that this wasn't just about the company anymore. This was about me. For years, I had worked in the shadow of my family's expectations, trying to prove myself and earn their approval. But now, for the first time, I wasn't doing it for them. I was doing it because I believed in what the company could become, and because I believed in myself, so I said yes. Since then, things have been surprisingly good. The company is finally back on stable footing, and we've even started to grow again. Jenna officially became my right hand, and Lucas has been consulting for us on big projects. The team is more motivated than ever, and I've made it a priority to create a culture where everyone feels valued, something that was sorely lacking under Mason's leadership. As for my personal life, I'm finally learning to set boundaries. For years, I let my parents' opinions dictate my decisions, but not anymore. I still see them occasionally, but I've made it clear that our relationship will never return to the way it was. If they can't respect me as an equal, then they don't get to be part of my life. Haley and I have grown closer, which has been a silver lining in all of this. She's been a great sounding board, and we've started meeting up regularly to talk about everything from work to life in general. It feels good to have at least one family member I can rely on. And Mason? Last I heard, he was living in his beachfront condo, posting Instagram stories about his hustle and grind. I wish him well, but I'm not holding my breath for an apology. Looking back, I think the hardest part of all of this wasn't losing my job or dealing with Mason's antics. It was realizing just how far my parents were willing to go to protect their own interests, even at my expense. That hurt more than anything Mason did, but in a way, it was also freeing. Once I stopped chasing their approval, I started seeing things more clearly. At the end of the day, I'm proud of what I've accomplished, not just professionally, but personally. I stood up for myself, fought for what I believed in, and came out stronger on the other side. The company is thriving, my relationships are healthier, even if fewer, and for the first time in a long time, I feel like I'm exactly where I'm supposed to be. So what? That's my story. If you're going through something similar, whether it's family drama, workplace politics, or just trying to figure out where you fit in the world, my advice is this: trust yourself. People will try to make you doubt your instincts, but deep down, you know what's right. Fight for it. It's worth it.